So as we all know, Fallout 3 ended with a Brotherhood victory. Not only were the Enclave defeated at the Jefferson Memorial before they could activate Project Purity, but they were also defeated again at the Adams Air Force Base. So by the time Fallout 4 occurs, the Enclave may have been totally wiped out, both as evidenced by Grand Zealot Richter from the Far Harbor DLC, and it's often speculated within the community that the iBots that you occasionally see roaming the Commonwealth may have been Enclave iBots that were once spewing President Eden's propaganda. But you have to wonder, what if the Enclave managed to win during the events of Fallout 3, and how could this affect the events of Fallout 4? Well, today, I'm going to attempt to answer that question. But before we start discussing the idea of an Enclave victory and start to define what that would be, we should probably discuss some of the tensions among the Enclave's leadership, namely between President Eden himself and Colonel Autumn. As you will eventually discover during your Fallout 3 playthrough, the Enclave is split between two different camps. There is President Eden, who originally got in contact with the Enclave after the destruction of the Enclave oil rig in Fallout 2, and convinced them to travel across the American wasteland and relocate at Raven Rock. The other camp is led by Colonel Autumn, who, by the time of the events of Fallout 3, serves as the Enclave's supreme military commander and commands the respect of the vast majority of the Enclave's human personnel. The issue that President Eden and Colonel Autumn are divided on is Project Purity. Now, much like the Brotherhood ultimately do at the end of Fallout 3, Colonel Autumn desired to reactivate Project Purity as is and simply have it be under Enclave control rather than Brotherhood control. Now, President Eden, on the other hand, wanted the modified FEV to be added, which was something that Colonel Autumn thought was too extreme, as it would result in the death of super mutants, ghouls, and humans alike. And while Autumn and the mutation-free members of the Enclave would have been spared, I suppose Autumn simply felt that this method would have been too cruel, even for him. Now, the reason why fighting breaks out when the player visits Raven Rock is because Eden plans to use the Lone Wanderer to achieve his goals. And since the Lone Wanderer has no prior loyalty to the Enclave and is also not loyal to Colonel Autumn, Eden believes he can use the Lone Wanderer to exact his own vision for the Enclave, as is revealed by this line of dialogue.
Ah, yes, Colonel Autumn, my trusted subordinate. I'm sure you've noticed that Colonel Autumn and I do not see eye to eye these days. Figuratively speaking, of course. The good Colonel and I disagree on how best to approach the problem of the wasteland. He feels my methods are too extreme. He's allowed his humanity to cloud his objectivity. And now that he is publicly countermanding my orders, I can no longer rely on him. And so, I turn to you. I hope that you are able to see the larger picture, to understand what's at stake. And of course, if you're successful, there's a place for you in the Enclave. Perhaps you could succeed the Colonel as my confidant.
Ultimately, the tensions between these two are important in the sense that one of these individuals will have their vision realized depending on the actions of the Lone Wanderer. And I also suspect that the actions of President Eden in particular will have positive and negative effects on the Enclave going forward, provided that his gamble ends up paying off or not. But with that out of the way, let's discuss what an Enclave victory would be. From my perspective, the reason we need to define an Enclave victory is because it isn't really defined for us during the events of Fallout 3 or during Fallout 3's ending. In fact, I would argue that it's pretty much guaranteed that if the Lone Wanderer survives the events of Fallout 3 and Fallout 3's Broken Steel, that the Enclave don't really win at the game's end. And this is because the player defeats the Enclave at the Jefferson Memorial and retakes Project Purity during the Take It Back quest. And this is regardless of whether the player decides to infect Project Purity with modified FEV or not. Then, during Broken Steel, the Enclave are defeated again during the Brotherhood's assault on the Enclave Crawler during the Who Dares Wins quest. And this is regardless of whether the Lone Wanderer chooses to destroy either the Citadel or the Enclave Mobile Crawler. It's also worth mentioning that even if the player decides not to activate the self-destruct sequence that would destroy Raven Rock after meeting President Eden, it's later revealed by Elder Lyons that the Brotherhood attacked the Enclave's quote-unquote base of operations and defeated whatever Enclave forces were there, while Sarah Lyons and the Lone Wanderer were knocked out for the 2 weeks after the activation of Project Purity. However, here's a comparison between what Lyons says when the player destroys Raven Rock versus when the player doesn't destroy Raven Rock.
Yes, we most certainly did. Between your help in destroying their headquarters and their subsequent defeat at the Purifier, the Enclave was thrown into disarray. Liberty Prime has been assisting our forces in removing any remaining Enclave forces. Yes, we most certainly did. After securing the Purifier, our forces were sent to deal with the Enclave in full. The Pride and Liberty Prime made short work of their base of operations and have since been cleaning up pockets of resistance.
So regardless of what the player does, when you actually retake the Jefferson Memorial and you reactivate Project Purity, the Brotherhood will destroy Raven Rock. And just in case there is any doubt about this, if you visit Raven Rock after retaking the Jefferson Memorial and you didn't activate the self-destruct sequence when you visited with President Eden, Raven Rock will appear to be in ruins. With all of this said though, I suppose the Enclave could technically be in a more or less preserved state depending on the player's choices throughout their playthrough. For example, during the American Dream quest, the Lone Wanderer can give Colonel Autumn the code for Project Purity, after which Colonel Autumn ends up killing the Lone Wanderer. And it's safe to say that with the death of the Lone Wanderer at Colonel Autumn's hands, the ending of the events of Fallout 3 would be far different than what we actually see while playing through the game. After all, the player isn't really there to witness what happens after the Lone Wanderer's death. Alternatively, if you meet President Eden and you decided to add the modified FEV strain to Project Purity, this would also appear to potentially lead to an Enclave victory in the long term. At least, that's what President Eden seems to indicate when asked by the Lone Wanderer about what some of the effects of the modified FEV will be.
Anyone or anything that has been affected by mutation will be eliminated. You will likely be immune, thanks to your upbringing in the vault. Likewise, the good people of the Enclave will be unaffected as well. I understand that you may have become sympathetic to certain individuals in your travels. Individuals this will eliminate. Please recognize that the fate of our entire country rests on this plan. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good.
It's also worth mentioning that if you decided to not destroy the Enclave mobile crawler and opted to destroy the Citadel instead, then whatever is left of the Enclave could potentially reform at the mobile crawler at some point. Though, with a lot of the main Enclave forces defeated by the Lone Wanderer and the Brotherhood, it's hard to say what the Enclave's fate would be at that point. Ultimately though, my thinking is that the Enclave can either win or eventually win for Fallout 3's ending with 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1 involves Colonel Autumn capturing the Lone Wanderer after they exit Vault 87. Now, the Lone Wanderer complies with Autumn's demands to provide him with the code for Project Purity, and then Autumn kills the Lone Wanderer. From here, Autumn then goes on to presumably gain complete control of Project Purity and defeat the Brotherhood of Steel, making the Enclave the sole power in the Capital Wasteland. Scenario 2 involves President Eden successfully convincing the Lone Wanderer to infect Project Purity with the modified FEV. Now, while victory won't happen initially or even during the events of the game, Enclave victory will eventually come. After all, only the mutation-free humans in the Enclave or elsewhere would be able to survive and retake the Capital Wasteland. Scenario 3 is potentially an extension of Scenario 2, but it involves the Lone Wanderer destroying the Citadel and thus destroying Lion's Brotherhood of Steel along with it. And while the Enclave would have sustained heavy casualties during the battle for Adams Air Force Base, and of course the battle for Jefferson Memorial, it may be possible for the Enclave to reform with whatever soldiers they have left. And depending on whether FEV was added to Project Purity or not, the Enclave could still potentially win the Brotherhood-Enclave War or achieve a sort of Pyrrhic victory, only to be eventually crushed after the Brotherhood regroups. But let's discuss Scenario 1 in more depth. By killing the Lone Wanderer, Colonel Autumn would not only maintain control of Project Purity, but he would also have the means to activate it. And this would potentially give Colonel Autumn some leverage over President Eden, who was previously trying to speak with the Lone Wanderer in order to undermine Colonel Autumn's ambition of simply reactivating Project Purity as is. While it would still be possible for the Brotherhood of Steel to retake Project Purity with Liberty Prime due to the Lone Wanderer safely escorting Dr. Lee to the Citadel in a previous mission, without the ability to reactivate Project Purity, Dr. Lee and the Brotherhood aren't really in a position to retake the Jefferson Memorial. From there, perhaps sort of like we've seen with the Institute and Brotherhood in Fallout 4, the Enclave would have the upper hand and could possibly end up assaulting the Citadel and defeat the Brotherhood, even with Liberty Prime. And with the East Coast Brotherhood in ruins, the only group that would be capable of challenging the Enclave would be the Brotherhood Outcasts. And without Vertibird Tech or Liberty Prime, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to fight back against an Enclave assault. Now, on the one hand, this would be an excellent scenario for the Enclave, as it has the potential to preserve their military and prevents it from being totally wiped out at both the Jefferson Memorial and at the Adams Air Force Base. On the flip side, though, Colonel Autumn would still have to deal with President Eden, and while Autumn does have the respect and loyalty of his military, President Eden may try to undermine him at every turn, and Eden would still control Raven Rock, which Autumn may find to be less than ideal. So it might also be possible that tensions between the two could potentially spark the organization's demise. As you can imagine, this particular ending would greatly affect the events of Fallout 4, and part of the reason that the Brotherhood came to the Commonwealth in the first place is to stop the Institute from developing what they deem to be synth abominations. It's possible that if the Enclave won in Fallout 3 by killing the Lone Wanderer, maybe they wouldn't even come to the Commonwealth at all. Or perhaps they would, and instead of the Lone Wanderer witnessing the Pridwin arriving in the Commonwealth after killing Kellogg, maybe they witness some kind of Enclave ship instead. Unlike the other scenarios, I see this being more possible as most of the Enclave military might not be wiped out. After all, if the Lone Wanderer survives, the Enclave military is decimated twice, both at the Jefferson Memorial and then again at Adams Air Force Base. But now that we've discussed Scenario 1, let's discuss Scenario 2. While the Enclave would definitely lose Raven Rock and Colonel Autumn would also lose his main forces and possibly die, the Lone Wanderer would basically be enacting President Eden's plan for the Enclave anyway. As you can imagine, the addition of modified FEV to Project Purity would end up killing not only the mutated creatures of the wasteland, but it would also kill many of the local wastelanders that had gradually mutated over the centuries. However, the remaining members of the Enclave would be immune, and while the ramifications of adding the modified FEV would not occur immediately, by the events of Fallout 4, I think it's pretty much safe to say that the vast majority of the population in Rivet City, most of the Brotherhood of Steel and the Brotherhood Outcasts, along with anybody else living in various other Capital Wasteland settlements, would be dead. This would provide the Enclave the opportunity to rebuild and establish society as they see fit, without any competition from the likes of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Brotherhood Outcasts, or any other Capital Wasteland factions that you can think of. And assuming they use the GEC that the Lone Wanderer acquired from Vault 87, they may also be able to introduce pre-war wildlife to the region, ensuring that they have a steady supply of food as well. The major downside to this victory is the destruction it could potentially cause to the Enclave military. After all, the Enclave will lose at the Jefferson Memorial, and then they'll lose again at the Adams Air Force Base. And because the Brotherhood was able to defeat them at Raven Rock as well, it could prove to be fairly difficult for the Enclave to recover. However, the Enclave would eventually win, as the Brotherhood members, the local wastelanders, and other creatures of the Capital Wasteland would die off. Now, it's difficult to say how long this would take, but I would say that by the events of Fallout 4, the Enclave could potentially be well on its way in the recovery process. But like Scenario 1, this ending would greatly affect Fallout 4's plot. In fact, I think it's safe to say that Fallout 4 would have probably taken place in an entirely different part of the United States if the Enclave won in Fallout 3 by infecting Project Purity with modified FEV. But maybe in the 10 to 20 years after Fallout 4, say in the 2290s or 2300s, the Enclave could potentially invade the Commonwealth with weaponized FEV and ultimately end up contending with the Institute. After all, Generation 3 synth DNA is based on the DNA of Father, who is a mutation-free human. I would just say at the very least, the Enclave with modified or weaponized FEV versus the Institute could be a pretty interesting fight, because the Generation 3 synths are possibly immune and can go toe-to-toe with the Enclave. But finally, let's discuss Scenario 3. Now, a good argument can be made that Scenario 3 is similar to or simply an expansion of Scenario 2. After all, in Scenario 2, the Enclave are still defeated at Adams Air Force Base, and the Enclave mobile crawler can still be destroyed. However, Scenario 3 is important as it covers what happens if the Lone Wanderer destroys the Citadel, which could eliminate the Brotherhood of Steel, which is the greatest threat to the Enclave's existence. If the Lone Wanderer infects Project Purity with modified FEV, then destroying the Citadel simply makes it easier for the Enclave to potentially recover. But if the player chooses to not infect the water with FEV, destroying the Citadel really only results in a sort of Pyrrhic victory for the Enclave. After all, while the Enclave would have defeated the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel, they would still have to contend with the Brotherhood Outcasts, which could potentially be the Enclave's demise. And while the Enclave could still potentially win against the Outcasts, it's going to be far more difficult for them to do so. Why? Well, keep in mind that during the events of Fallout 3, the Brotherhood Outcasts don't really get involved with the Enclave Brotherhood War, so they're totally fresh and they could probably easily deal with the Enclave. Plus, keep in mind that whatever is left of the East Coast Brotherhood could simply integrate into the Outcasts, meaning that the Enclave could end up dealing with both the Outcasts and East Coast Brotherhood remnants. And for that reason, I would say that Scenario 3 would be the worst possible scenario for the Enclave if the modified FEV wasn't added to Project Purity. So, while the Enclave would technically win the war with the East Coast Brotherhood, I suspect that the Outcast would ultimately be the Enclave's demise, and perhaps instead of seeing the Brotherhood of Steel under Elder Maxon in Fallout 4, you may end up seeing the Brotherhood Outcasts in Fallout 4, led by someone else entirely. Or maybe the Outcasts just stay in the Capital Wasteland and continue to hoard technology like they always have. At the end of the day, though, what I think we can say for sure is that not just Fallout 4's plot, but perhaps a couple of the characters would be missing altogether, depending on what Enclave Victory scenario occurs. After all, Deacon has dialogue that seems to suggest that he's been to the Capital Wasteland, and if he drank the water there and it was infected with modified FEV, it would have probably killed him. Or in the case of Robert McCready, who was originally from Little Lamplight, if he drank the water that was modified with modified FEV, I think it's safe to say that he would probably be dead as well. Or depending on how events occurred, I also think it's possible that it could have simply been the Enclave on board the Prydwen instead of the Brotherhood of Steel, and much of Fallout 4's story could have progressed like normal. Though I think that in order for this to have happened, Colonel Autumn would have had to have killed the Lone Wanderer once Autumn received the Project Purity activation code. While we pretty much know that the Enclave is in really rough shape during the events of Fallout 4, I think it's definitely possible that the Lone Wanderer spared Colonel Autumn, and provided Autumn survived, perhaps we'll encounter him once again in a future game at the head of a brand new Enclave. But alright guys, I think that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see you all next time.